We tend to think of the resurrection as a religious belief, something you either accept by faith or reject outright. But what if that's the wrong category entirely? What if the resurrection of Jesus is actually a historical question? Because here's the surprising part. Whether you're Christian, an atheist, or somewhere in between, there are certain facts about Jesus' death and what followed that most scholars agree on. Well, hi all, I'm Lenny Esposito, and this week, the week of Easter, I wanted to take perhaps a new look at the Easter story and examine it, well, not from a faith perspective, but by using recognized historical criteria one could use to judge any recorded act in history. Now, for example, the most skeptical of scholars agree that the data shows that Jesus was crucified, that his followers believed that they saw him live again. And skeptics like Paul and James, well, they were suddenly transformed. Now, the question isn't whether these things happened. Again, most scholars agree. The question is, what best explains them? And once you start looking at the evidence, the resurrection stops sounding like a story and starts looking like a problem you have to solve. So let's jump into solving that problem coming up on this. Come let us reason together. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to another Come Let Us Reason. I'm glad you're joining me on Easter week. And for those who don't celebrate Easter, or perhaps don't celebrate the Christian idea of the resurrection, I'm glad you're here too, because this becomes really a crucial question in understanding why Christianity as a religion has established itself across the world. You see, the early church also had this difficulty. The apostles, upon Jesus' death, didn't necessarily believe that he was going to rise again. They didn't seem to understand the promises and the prophecies that Jesus really told them over and over again. Well, it seemed fantastical. He must have meant something else. And what we find today is many people hold the same idea. They can't believe in a person dying and then rising again from the dead after just a few days. How can that be? It bucks against all of our explanations. It bucks against all of what we've seen and what we understand in the world. But it happened, and the apostles were faced with the question of what to do with the new facts that they had found. Today, I hope to explore some of those facts as well, to look at Jesus from a historical perspective. Now, when we start asking questions about history, there's a lot of things people assume. For example, here's a few true or false questions. True or false? Columbus discovered that the earth was round. Well, actually, that's not true. People had known that the earth was round well before Columbus's day. It's something that has caught on in the popular ideology that Columbus somehow was the first person to go west because he believed the earth was round and most people didn't, that they would fall off the edge. But that's actually not true. Most people, even since the Greek era, had understood that the earth was some kind of sphere. How about this one? People in Brazil don't speak Spanish. Is that true or false? Well, that's true, actually. Brazilians speak Portuguese. So again, here's an idea that all Latin America is Spanish-speaking, and that's not actually the case. How about Napoleon was shorter than average for his time? Actually, not so. Napoleon was probably about average height. He just wasn't statuesque and tall. Or how about this? The United States declared independence from Britain on July 4th, 1776. Well, no, that's actually not the case. It was July 2nd where the United States declared independence from Britain. But in order for them to sign the document, get it written up, it actually took an extra 2 days. And so they dated the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. It was interesting that John Adams thought that July 2nd would be the day that Americans would celebrate their independence. So here we see several different questions of history that people sometimes get wrong. And it shouldn't surprise us that something as fantastic as the resurrection is something that people can get wrong as well. In fact, there is a book written by a gentleman by the name of Earl Doherty, and in his book, Jesus, Neither God Nor Man, The Case for a Mythical Jesus, Doherty opens with this claim, quote, "Once upon a time, someone wrote a story about a man who was God. We do not know who that someone was or where he wrote his story. We are not even sure when he wrote it, but we do know that several decades have passed since the supposed events he told in the book." Doherty goes on to say later generations gave this storyteller the name of Mark, but if it was his real name, it was only by coincidence. Other writers followed after, and they enlarged on the first one's tale. They borrowed much of what he had written, reworked it in their own particular ways, and put in some additional materials. By the time another half century had passed, almost everyone who followed the religion of these storytellers accepted their work as an account of actual historical events and a real historical man. And so did the people who came afterwards for close to 2,000 years. Now, is Doherty right in these things? Let's see what we can find out from our study. Well, if we look at the Gospel of Luke, for example, Luke says that when he's writing these things, he simply isn't grasping at stories. Luke actually says in Luke chapter 1 that he went to undertake and compile an account of the things. In fact, Luke chapter 1 opens with his claim that he is investigating the aspects and the history of Jesus much as an investigative reporter would. He goes to interview people, he goes to check them out, and he goes to try and build a complete timeline of who Jesus is and what events he experienced up and through his resurrection. He writes, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us," Luke chapter 1, verse 1, he says, "just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely and for some time past, to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." Now notice that language there, that he had familiarity with the stories, but he wanted to dig in further. He'd been following them closely, but he wanted to put them in an orderly account, to explain them in a rational way, if you will. And he wanted them to have a certainty to it. So this is not Luke just following some carefully devised tales. This is Luke trying to present the story of Jesus in an orderly manner. And that's the first point that we fall on when we are looking at the question of whether Jesus and his resurrection can be understood in a way that we can gain knowledge from a historical perspective as opposed to, say, just a religious perspective. The Gospels themselves, number one, present themselves as historical perspectives, as historical narratives. Now, there are standard criteria historians use when weighing evidence for particular historical events. And C.B. McCullough has put together a pretty decisive list. He's one of the top historical scholars that deals with these kinds of issues. But let's enumerate at least some of the specific ideas and ways that we can discern what counts as history versus what counts as, say, just myth or legend. Number one, you have to have multiple independent sources to support a historical claim. Now, it's not always crucial to have multiple sources. We don't necessarily have multiple sources on every account, but the more sources you have, if you have multiple independent sources, that makes the credibility of the statements higher, right? The account has different people saying the same kinds of things. Secondly, attestation by an enemy Well, that supports historical claims. Tends to be that your enemies don't talk about you unless they're actually dealing with an issue that they had to resolve in some way. They don't like giving ink to their opponents, and especially in the ancient world where it was very, very costly to either write something down, to reproduce it on parchments, or to engrave it in stone or what have you. So multiple independent sources, attestation by an enemy, embarrassing admissions. Now, the fact that an account might have certain admissions in it that are embarrassing, that don't make the followers or the protagonist look the best, those tend to support historical claims, because if you're making something up, why do you want to make those people who are supposed to be the leaders of your organization look foolish, right? That doesn't help you draw more adherents to your cause. Fourth, eyewitness testimony. The closer you can get to the events, if you have people who actually see it, those become a more powerful testimony. And then, of course, early testimony supports historical claims. And that's the last piece that we have to understand here, is that the closer you are to describing the actual events, the chances are there's less opportunity for that event to be manipulated or misremembered or shifted, through history. You often hear the comparison of the game of telephone. And the idea is that as it goes through iteration after iteration after iteration, you don't quite know how clear and how sharp those memories are, or if they've been twisted and misremembered and then remembered over generations. So those are 5 supporting ideas for how we determine history. And we'll take a look at each one of these from a gospel perspective. Now, we know that the gospel accounts were written to be historical accounts of eyewitnesses. For eyewitnesses were considered the most valuable of sources, especially in ancient history. And this is an important point that a lot of people don't realize. You hear the objection many times, well, how come the Gospels were written so much later than Jesus' day? Why didn't they just write them down as Jesus was saying it? Well, this assumes a modern view of recording history and as opposed to an ancient view. In the modern world, we like to write things down because it's easy to circulate books. It's easy to circulate emails or posts or things like that. It has been usually the case that the more you write it down, the less you'll forget and things like that. Well, actually, in the ancient world, the opposite was true. They thought eyewitnesses were much more reliable than the written word. And the primary reason for that was that eyewitnesses could be cross-examined. So, for example, the quote, the ancient historians, such as Thucydides, Polybius, Josephus, and Tacitus, they were all convinced that the true history could be written only while the events were still within living memory. And they valued as their sources the oral reports of direct experience of the events by involved participants in them. In other words, if you were involved in this situation, if you were there, that became the most valuable testimony to the validity of that event. Ideally, the historian himself should have to be a participant in the events he narrates. As, for example, Xenophon, Thucydides, and Josephus, they all were. But since Luke could not have been at all the events he recounts or in all the places he describes, the historian also has to rely on eyewitnesses whose living voices he could hear and whom he himself could question. And again, that's the idea that you can go in and say, well, wait a minute, what about this point? You can't do that with a written word. You have to just kind of trust the word, and you can't cross-examine it, so forth. So one of the things that happens in the gospel accounts is they are engaging in this kind of approach where they're telling the story from the point of view of people who were actually there. Another quote, trusting testimony is not an irrational act of faith that leaves critical rationality aside. It is, on the contrary, the rationally appropriate way of responding to authentic testimony, Richard Bauckham tells us in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. So here we see that eyewitness testimony is the highest form of testimony. And again, we see this when Paul starts talking to those in the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, hey, you have people here who saw this, you can go and ask them yourself. Or how Luke, again, is saying, I went to the eyewitnesses, I asked them, I cross-examined them, and this is why I put these accounts down. Now, why were then the Gospels written if this eyewitness testimony is so important? Well, if you think about it, the Gospels needed to be recorded because while the testimony of the apostles was preeminent, while it was considered the best type of testimony, it wouldn't last forever, would it? The Gospels were actually written down because the apostles were getting older. They were starting to die. Now, if we figure that Jesus was crucified in either AD 30 or AD 33, we don't know when, but the Gospels start showing up some 30 to 50 years after the events of the crucifixion and resurrection. If we look at most conservative estimates, Matthew may be around 60 AD, Luke, AD 65. Mark probably predates all of them, AD 55 to 58, somewhere in there. John, AD 95, probably not much later than that. There are those scholars who date all the gospel accounts before AD 70. But we know that we found the John Ryland's papyrus, that P52, the famous early script of John. That dates somewhere between AD 125 or so, and it's a copy. We know it's a copy, which means that the original had to be written before AD 125, and the original had to be so well known, and it was probably copied again. And copies take a while. They don't, again, it's not like today where you can just rip them off of a printing press. These were all handwritten. And then when somebody would go to the next church, he'd take his copy with him, and then somebody would copy that. So it took years for copies to start being disseminated across the different churches. So if the copy we have is AD 125, most even the skeptical scholars are hard-pressed to try and date John before AD 95. But if John's AD 95, again, then you start working backwards. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are prior to John. And of course, Matthew and Luke borrow from Mark. So Mark is prior to Matthew and Luke. And this is where we get this chronology. Most scholars think, or a significant number of scholars, I should say, think that it's much more likely that the Gospels were written prior to the fall of the temple, and we know exactly when that happened. That was AD 70, when Titus Vespasian and his Roman legions came into Jerusalem and toppled the temple. And the reason why that is because we have predictions from Jesus' lips that the temple would fall and that not one stone would be left upon another. All of these predictions are there, but it never has their fulfillment recorded in the Gospels. And certainly it would have helped the Gospel writers' credibility to say, and you know that the temple fell, so therefore these predictions came true, that kind of thing. But we even have a narrative of the crucifixion and resurrection that predates all four Gospels. And that is the passage in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 15, 5 through, say, 8. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5. And then Paul, writing the Corinthian church, tells him that he's giving them what he first received. And we know that 1 Corinthians was probably written somewhere between AD 53 to AD 55. So very, very close, within 20 years or so of the events that are described. Paul says, hey, look, here is something that I was taught when I became a Christian. So it's AD 53 to 55. And he talks about Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And if Paul was taught that when he was a Christian, we know again when he went to Corinth, Acts 18 tells us that he was visiting Corinth somewhere about AD 49. He writes the letter to 1 Corinthians after he's left, but he said, I told this to you when I was there. And if he told that to them when he was there, and you go back to, well, wait a minute, Paul's saying he got this himself, that he was taught this when he first became a Christian. Now we take that 1 Corinthians 15 passage, and we could probably push it all the way back to AD 36 or AD 35. There are some scholars who think that because it was established as kind of a method of claiming Christianity, it's kind of an oath, a creed, if you will, an early Christian creed that is established by AD 36. It had to take 2 to 3 years for that to even formulate for its establishment. So now you're talking about right on top of the actual events from within maybe a couple of years, who knows? There are certain scholars who put it even within months of the crucifixion, that you have this creed that comes out very early on. So what we see is that the narratives are actually right about the time the apostles are getting old and the apostles are starting to die. And that's what we see, and that's what Bauckham argues in his book. He says that the dates of the Gospels align with the times when the eyewitness testimony was starting to become scarce. He writes, quote, the Gospels were written within living memory of the events they recount. Mark's Gospel was written well within the lifetime of many of the eyewitnesses, while the other 3 canonical Gospels were written in a period when the living eyewitnesses were becoming scarce, exactly at the point in time when their testimony would perish were it not put down in writing. So this is what we find in why the gospel accounts started to be written down, and why perhaps they weren't written down prior to that, because the eyewitnesses were still alive and you could talk to them. And in fact, when we look at other accounts and we trace those, we can see that they do trace back to the eyewitness accounts. For example, Papias was a bishop of Hierapolis, and he wrote around AD 110. Now, Bauckham in his book points to Papias and says he knew that Papias confirmed that the Gospels came from those who sat at the feet of the apostles, right? Papias himself, according to the preface in his volumes, in no way presents himself as having been a listener. In other words, he wasn't an eyewitness of the apostles. He himself didn't learn from them directly. But he does say that he had received the articles of the faith from those who had known them. So in other words, there are students of the apostles, and they would visit him in his church, and he would talk with them. And the passage in Papias says, but whenever someone who had followed the presbyters came along, I would carefully ask about the words of the presbyters, what Andrew or what Peter had said, or what Philip or what Thomas or what James or what John or Matthew or any of the other Lord's disciples had said, and which Aristian and the presbyter John, disciples of the Lord, say too. So here are a couple of other people who were part of Jesus' larger circle. But Papias goes on to say, for I did not assume that whatever comes from books is as helpful to me as what comes from a living and lasting voice. So you hear both aspects of what the ancient mind was thinking here in Papias's quote. First of all, he doesn't necessarily think that the books are worthy to be held in complete trust just by themselves. Think of it this way. It's kind of like, don't believe everything you read online. Just because someone posts it on the internet doesn't mean that you should believe it. Check it out. Well, in the ancient world, just because someone wrote it down doesn't mean you should believe it. We got to check it out. No, but he said, if they had followed one of the people who sat at Jesus' feet, someone who had followed the presbyters came along, okay? If they learned that, then you would say, well, wait a minute. Tell me exactly what those guys said. You carefully ask about the words of those presbyters. Presbyters, just the church leaders. And again, they didn't assume books are as helpful as eyewitnesses were. So Papias is checking it out. This is just one generation removed now from Jesus. It was Jesus, it was the apostles and the disciples of Jesus. And then it's these guys saying, well, wait a minute, let me know. This is very important because what we're finding is that it's not that the ancient world was some gullible group of individuals who would simply accept any myth that happened to roll down the street. You know, people seem to think that today we're so smart and we're so evolved and we're so educated that, of course, we can't be fooled by some of these claims. But those guys back then, oh, they would just want to believe anything and everything. And that's simply not true. In fact, I often make the point that in terms of death and resurrection, the ancients were much better and much more familiar with what death looked like than you and I, because we take our elderly, our infirmed, our sick, and we put them away in hospitals, we put them away in nursing homes, we shelter them in palliative care centers. We don't want to get our hands dirty. Back then, you knew what death looked like because people would die in your house, and those dead bodies would stay in your house until the time of the burial. Therefore, you couldn't just pull one over on people and say, oh, resurrection. No, they knew what death was. Death was death, and it was in your face, clear about that. So it's wrong. It's kind of historical snobbery, really, to think that these people in these eras somehow just bought any old story that came along. In fact, the ancients actually had a very high bar for keeping facts straight. They knew there was a penchant for individuals to overemphasize things or want to claim their position. And historians of the ancient world, well, they'd police each other just like today. They would check each other out, right? Peer review is the word we use today. But as Craig Keener notes, historians harshly criticized other historians whom they accused of promoting falsehood, especially when they were thought to exhibit self-serving agendas. So here, Keener is making the point that it's true that historians would push against one another. In fact, Polybius's criticism of Timaeus, that happened 150 years before Christ, where we read, no one can help admiring the richness of the country. And one is inclined to say that Timaeus was not only unacquainted with Africa, but that he was childish and entirely deficient in judgment, and was still fettered by the ancient report handed down to us that the whole of Africa is sandy, dry, and unproductive. The same holds good regarding the number of animals, for the number of horses, oxen, sheep, and goats in the country is so large that I doubt if so many could be found in the rest of the world, because many of the African tribes make no use of the cereals, but live on the flesh of their cattle and among their cattle. Again, all are aware of the number and strength of the elephants, lions, and panthers in Africa, of the beauty of its buffaloes and the size of its ostriches, creatures that do not exist in all of Europe, while Africa is full of them. Timaeus has no information on this subject, and it seems of set purpose to tell the exact opposite of the actual facts. So here you go. Here's the type of kind of takedown that we see in ancient history, where you're just being decimated for making things up. Timaeus had never actually been to Africa, or he's been to one local part of Africa, and he's assuming all of the continent is just the way that he's describing it. And he's just decimated by the reply. Here's another one. Pliny the Younger always wrote that throughout that history should be done with, quote, fidelity and truth. So again, emphasizing this idea that you can get it wrong. And by the way, Pliny the Younger also thought it isn't illogical to trust testimony. Eyewitness accounts are one way we get evidence, and you can't simply readily dismiss it. Now, Craig Keener goes on and says, quote, ancients readily distinguished between the goals of history and those of less factual epic poetry. He makes that point, understanding that when we approach history, you're doing something different than spinning a grand narrative, right? So when we watch films and when we watch something that's, quote, based on actual events, you should know that while the story may in broad strokes be true, the purpose of that film is to entertain. And sometimes what you get are characters that are compiled together, an amalgam of different people. Sometimes you get things made up out of whole cloth. You think of the epic series Rome, where they do touch on some of the major historical events, but the two main characters that go through those main events, and most of what you're seeing there is complete fiction. It's not documentary. We can distinguish against something that is being approached as a documentary, which, by the way, documentaries have their own slant. And just because something is promoted as a documentary doesn't mean it's telling you all the facts. It's itself weaving together a story. But a documentary is far different from a film, which is meant to entertain. And those two things we can discern immediately. And we don't approach film the way we approach, say, a documentary. And we don't approach a documentary, say, the way we approach reading historical books by historical scholars. Those are different. And so we have to understand that the gospel accounts are written as what we call biography. They fall within a very specific genre of writing known in the ancient world at this time that seeks to tell a historical tale. So what we're doing is we're understanding from a historical perspective the life of Jesus. That's what the gospel accounts are trying to approach the facts as, and it's not epic history, it's not poetry, it's not fable. It's really begging to be understood or approaching itself to be understood, presenting itself as history, as historical facts. Well, what are these historical facts that we can ascertain? As I said, there are certain things that when scholars approach this question, they look at. And Dr. Gary Habermas has made it one of his life's works to go through many of the different scholars of the New Testament. And he's talked to individuals from across the spectrum. There are New Testament scholars, of course, who are evangelical, who believe the Gospels. There are mainline scholars who may not hold to inerrancy, but they hold to the Bible's understanding and its presentation in broad strokes. There are New Testament scholars who are Jewish. There are New Testament scholars who are atheists and who are skeptics. There are many New Testament scholars across a wide spectrum of different belief systems, but they do approach the Gospels from a historical perspective. So what can they tell us? What can we know about the resurrection? And what we find is that there are certain facts recorded about the resurrection events that are both accepted by liberal as well as conservative scholars, by the vast majority of them. And so let's take a look at these facts. We'll look at the 5 main facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus and how scholars across the different venues agree on them. The first is Jesus died by crucifixion. The second is the burial of Jesus is historically reliable. Jesus' tomb was discovered empty a few days after he was buried. The disciples' experiences in seeing the risen Jesus, they had some kind of experience that they were reacting to. And then lastly, that there were conversions of skeptics, those who are skeptical of Jesus' death. So these are the 5 facts that I want to explore. First of all, Let's take Jesus died by crucifixion. Now, this is nearly universally accepted. Yes, you have a few Jesus mythers like Doherty, but those guys who hold to those views, they're not New Testament scholars. They are different stripe of folks. Matter of fact, even Bart Ehrman, who's a significant skeptic, doubter, and atheist, will tell you that to write Jesus off as a myth is just something that is unacceptable from a scholastic perspective. If you want to be a New Testament scholar, no matter what your position is on the resurrection, but if you write off Jesus as a myth, you just won't find a New Testament scholar accepted in any teaching institution that does so. And that's not me saying that. That's Bart Ehrman. So let's approach these one at a time. First of all, Jesus died by crucifixion, right? And it's nearly universally accepted. Remember the criteria I talked about. And one of the points of criteria is embarrassment, an embarrassment criteria. First of all, we know that the earliest sources of testimony argue for Jesus' death. As I pointed out, the testimony of Paul in 1 Corinthians verses 3 through 5, and actually you can extend that from 3 through 12 because Paul adds his own testimony in seeing the risen Christ after the fact. Mark 15, 33 through 47 is very early. And of course, all four of the Gospels have testimony of Jesus being crucified. Now, again, crucifixion is the most heinous way to die, and not simply because it was the most painful, but it was painful and degrading so much that Roman citizens could not be put to death by crucifixion. It was considered for the lowest of the low. So again, think about the claim Doherty made, that this tale, this account by this unknown author came about where Jesus is crucified and rose again, and people started believing it afterwards. Well, why would you believe that in the ancient world? I mean, it's tantamount to today saying, I want to create a brand new faith. I want to create a brand new religion. I want to get the nonprofit status. I want to get the tax exemption. So I'm going to create something, but I better have a whole lot of people follow me, because in order to do that, that way I can make a lot of money, right? People will donate, and that's the only reason why I would want to do this. So how do I do it? Well, I'll create a Messiah figure. I'll create someone whom the people can put their trust in, and I'll make him a convicted pedophile. Nobody would do that, because the idea that you're a convicted pedophile and people would want to emulate you, it's hideous. It pulls back. But the crucifixion is that in ancient Rome. All the Gospels attest to this. And this is one of the reasons why historians have to say, yeah, it's probably true. It has independent sources. So 1 Corinthians 15, that's Paul, that's one source. Mark is a second source. He's independent of Paul. He doesn't copy Paul at all. Maybe Matthew and Luke copy Mark. So maybe you can't call Matthew and Luke independent, because they seem to have had Mark's testimony before they wrote their own. But John writes a completely different gospel. And so John is considered independent. So we have testimony from multiple independent sources in the Gospels and in 1 Corinthians. But we don't simply have that. We have testimony from non-Christian sources as well. Of course, the most interesting one is the one that Josephus writes. Now, Josephus isn't a Christian. He's a Jew. He's living in late antiquity. And as T.C. Schmidt and his new book that has come out, which is making quite a headway, makes the case that these passages in Josephus's Antiquities, the Christ passages, and Schmidt argues really kind of convincingly that Josephus, who knew the high priestly family, so he knew the people who were present at the trial of Jesus, he would talk with them. Josephus, in other parts of his account, recognizes and promotes the idea that he engaged with these guys. He was a Pharisee. He was reared in that culture, and he had talked with them, had family friendships with them. These things. He says that this passage, Antiquities 18 of Jesus, is probably wholly true, but it doesn't play the way the modern ear thinks. So the passage that Schmidt is pointing to, he thinks that it wasn't a Christian interpolation. In other words, Christians didn't take Josephus's passage and change it. But Josephus was trying to explain, almost in a mocking way, what the Christians believed. But here's the passage. Here's one of the testimonies of the death and resurrection of Jesus from a non-Christian source. So Josephus in Antiquities 1864 writes, "When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had him condemned to be crucified." So that's Antiquities 1864. Here again, Josephus is saying Jesus was crucified. Tacitus, reporting on how the Christians were dealing with, or how the Romans, I should say, were dealing with the new Christian movement, he had to write back to the emperor. And as he goes and researches these things, he says, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, had suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And that's in Annals 15:14. So here's Tacitus saying that Jesus was crucified. Lucian of Samosata writes, quote, "The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. Even the Jewish Talmud mentions Jesus in the fact that he was put to death." So here we see again, over and over again, non-Christian sources say that Jesus existed and that he was put to death by crucifixion. So we have an awful lot of evidence to say there was a guy by the name of Jesus of Nazareth who lived, who, because of his teachings, was put to death by the leaders of the Jewish movement. Now, as I said, crucifixion would be an embarrassment to any new religious movement because it was only reserved for the most heinous villains in the dregs of society. I mean, the Jesus Seminar, even when they were voting on, what's true and what's not true, could not get around this. John Dominic Crossan remarked, quote, "that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be," end quote. Now think about that. There is no way that the crucifixion of Jesus did not occur. If you understand what the ancient mind held the contempt for the cross to be. I mean, you wouldn't even say the word. It was considered so terrible that it was like the N-word today. You can't even mention it. You would flinch at reading it. And in polite society, you would never mention crucifixion. So was Jesus crucified? Historical fact. Nobody of any repute doubts that. How about the burial of Jesus? Is the burial of Jesus historically reliable? Well, all the earliest accounts of Jesus' death seem to include his burial. 1 Corinthians 3-5 is that, and as we talked about, that kind of creed really is established within just a couple of years of Jesus' death. It's one of the oldest traditions, so that we see that there's the death and the burial. Those two things happen together. Mark 15:42 and 47. Again, no breaks in this narrative. This is one story. And if the crucifixion is true, the burial follows naturally. Plus, these burial accounts, there's no any legendary elements, right? It's not like seeing, say, Elvis, at the local 7-Eleven or something like that. There's no flourishing. There's no glowing from inside the tomb or anything like that. It's matter of fact. That's all that happens. You died, and Jewish rituals of that day would want those individuals to be buried. The Jewish, we have tons of ossuaries. We know how the Jewish people of the first century processed their victims. And it would just be a natural aspect of being Jewish. This is what that faith culture did. Now, are crucifixion victims buried? Well, that's another question that sometimes is arisen because, as you know, some of the scholars would say, oh, Jesus wasn't buried. He was thrown into a grave with common criminals or things like that. You wouldn't bury a crucifixion victim, you know. Hey, I thought you said that the crucifixion was so terrible that any of the victims would just be left. Well, not necessarily. That's not true in the ancient world. And we can prove this because we've found evidence, archaeological evidence, to the contrary. So I'll put the picture on the screen here. And what you're seeing is the heel bone of Yohanan ben Hakol. Now, this was a Jewish resident of Jerusalem, okay, who was crucified. We found these remains in an ossuary, in a first century coffin, if you will, a bone box. What the Jewish people would do is they would lay the body in a tomb. They would let it decompose after a year. And then when only the bones were left, they would scoop them up and they'd put them in these smaller bone boxes that were maybe, 2 meters by, maybe 1 meter, maybe 3 feet by 1.5 feet, something like that, 4 feet, depending on the size of the ossuary and the value or the prestige of the recipient. They would put them in these bone boxes because it was much easier to store, right? You dug a family crypt, which was expensive enough, and then you'd be able to put multiple people in these crypts because they took up less space, so to speak. So we found one of these ossuaries, and in it, you have this heel bone. This heel bone was punctured by an iron nail, and we know that they couldn't get the nail out. Normally they would remove it, but you see the tip of the nail is bent. But it is the only tangible evidence that we have for the practice of crucifixion. And it's the only one that we found in archaeological excavations. Let me say that specifically. The bone was found inside an ossuary in a cave in North Jerusalem, and it is inscribed with the name of the deceased, Yohanan, son of Hakol. Now, he was a young Jew in his 20s, and his relatives, when took him down for burial, of course, they couldn't get his right foot out from the wooden post because that nail was bent. It must have hit a knot or something. So as a result, they removed part of the cross along with the body, and we found, again, that nail has some wood shards in it. But here's my point. To say that they would never bury crucifixion victims is patently false because we have the archaeological evidence. We have an actual person who was buried after being crucified. So we can't discount that. So the burial of Jesus follows from the crucifixion very, very naturally. We know that Jesus was crucified. We know that he was buried. And thirdly, we know that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty just a few days later. Now, this requires you to really stop a little bit and think, because it's Jerusalem. And how do people lie or create a myth in a city like this when the evidence would be right before them? In other words, how do you lie about an empty tomb where people were there when Jesus was crucified and buried and had firsthand knowledge of the events? In fact, if you are the Sanhedrin, if you are those who are so dead set against Jesus and his teachings that you appeal to Pilate for guards to guard the tomb, that you say, we are going to, stomp out this travesty. In Acts chapter 5, they call Peter and John and arrest them because they're preaching the empty Jesus. They are not wanting this story to get out. Why wouldn't they have simply said, look, let's go take a look at the tomb. Let's go take a look at the body, right? What are some of those methods again. Enemy attestation is one of these historical methods. What do the enemies of Jesus say? Well, the enemies of Jesus say that the tomb is empty. In fact, the enemies claim that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. That was the story. Well, why would they claim that they stole the body of Jesus unless the body wasn't there anymore? The actual claim by the Jewish hierarchy implies the tomb was empty. Matthew 28, 12 to 13, right? We see that. But it's not simply there. Justin Martyr in Trifo 100 reiterates this claim that the Jewish hierarchy said that the body was stolen. Tertullian makes note of it as well, that this was the standard story of why the tomb was empty. And most importantly, there's no alternate theories offered by Jesus' enemies of any, not that they went to the wrong tomb, not that Jesus himself got up out of the tomb. They would have thought that ridiculous. I mean, how in the world can somebody who, somehow survived the professional killers of the Roman legions who had hung him on a cross after a severe beating, and, saying that he laid there open wounded in a dark and cold grave, that it somehow revived him and he was able to push open a 2-ton stone by himself. He had the strength to do that, even though he was, wounded within an inch of his life. No, that doesn't fly with me. It doesn't make any sense. So there's no other theories as to why the tomb was empty, except that the disciples stole the body. But that means that the tomb had to be empty. So we have Jesus died by crucifixion. We have that he was buried. We have that the tomb was empty. Well, what's the third piece of evidence that we have? Well, it's the testimony of women. Now, remember, I told you that the criteria of embarrassment is a big issue, that people don't tend to make up myths that are embarrassing to them. And in the gospel accounts, we see that not only are the eyewitnesses of Jesus' death women, but also they are the first people to the empty tomb, and they are the first people to see the risen Jesus. They're listed as the primary witnesses. But this doesn't make sense in this ancient culture, especially a Jewish culture, because women's testimony was held in very low esteem. Most people would dismiss women as being, at that point, prone to fantasy. In fact, women's testimony wasn't even held in the same esteem as, say, robbers. In the Talmud, in Sota 19, we read, quote, "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to a woman." So that's the Talmud. Even before that, Josephus in Antiquities wrote, quote, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on the account of the levity and the boldness of their sex." So here you see that Josephus is saying that women's testimony isn't valid in Jewish courts. And they go on to say, quote, "Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Also, they are not valid to offer." This is equivalent to saying, basically, rabbinically, one would say a robber is qualified to give the same evidence as a woman. And that comes even out of the Talmudic teachings as well. So you see that women were not held in high regard, that their eyewitness accounts wouldn't necessarily hold sway. Why do the gospel writers all put the first witnesses of the risen Jesus in Mary Magdalene's eyes? Why is it that she is the one who tells the apostles, Peter and John and the others, that Jesus has risen again? Why in Matthew does Jesus appear to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary? Yeah, see, listing women as the first to believe and report the empty tomb, well, that would be damaging to the faith. That wouldn't attract people. That would probably distract people or repel people. But women see the empty tomb. That's listed in all 4 of the Gospels. Now, Luke and John record the disciples visiting the tomb, but only afterwards. all four of them have the women visiting a tomb. And of course, they see Jesus. Now, this is my fourth point, that the disciples experienced in seeing the risen Jesus. They had some kind of experience that they felt was the risen Jesus. Okay? Now, I'm going to nuance this a little bit, because when we talk about the vast majority of scholars, they wouldn't say the disciples saw Jesus. Many, again, of those in the skeptical side don't hold to supernatural claims, so they have to nuance it. But they all recognize that there was some life-changing event. There was something that each one of them experienced. All the disciples experienced something, and it was so life-changing to them that it changed who they were and how they approached the world. What did the disciples say that experience was? Well, they all claimed that it was seeing the risen Jesus. And that's the point. Paul lists a summary of the appearances to the disciples in the 1 Corinthians 15, right? Appeared to Peter, and then the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one, and then last of all, he appeared to me, is the way Paul writes it. And he even says, in that 500 brethren, he tells the Corinthians, yeah, some have died by the time I'm writing this letter to you, in the 20 or so years between the time I received this and what I'm telling you now. But you know that some are still alive. Go ask them. Again, trying to tell them, check it out for yourself. Get the eyewitness testimony if that's what you want to believe. But so Paul lists a summary of the appearances to the disciples. Oral tradition, like the 1 Corinthians 15 passage, passed through the early church, and they became these creeds, these definitive statements. We know that 1 Corinthians, for example, is one of the oldest portions of the New Testament. It predates all four Gospels. As I said, it was written somewhere AD 53 to 57. And it establishes this, but it's not the only thing. There are sermon summaries. If you look through the book of Acts, for example, there are different sermons that Peter and others preach. And those sermons recorded in Acts probably came out of oral traditions, again, sometime within 20 years of Jesus' death. And there they talk about the eyewitness testimony as well. Acts chapter 2. Peter says, look, men of Jerusalem, when 40 days after the resurrection, and Peter is talking to the crowd, he goes, you guys yourselves know these things. You've seen this. You don't have to rely on just my word, right? You've been in Jerusalem. You know this stuff. Jesus was, his death was front page news. It was all over the place. So you know that what I'm saying is true, and you know that we've seen this, and that for 40 days we were talking with him, and we've claimed these kinds of things. Also, when you look at the history of the early church and the different written works, all of them claim to have seen the risen Jesus. The apostolic fathers, they were transformed, for example. If you think about what happened on the night that Jesus was taken, the disciples all scattered. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. They were scared. They were huddled together. And yet, just a few weeks later, you have Peter and John marching into the temple, healing a gentleman and proclaiming, it is the risen Lord, whom you crucified. We cannot stop preaching about this Jesus. We must obey God rather than men. How did they become such bold proclaimers? This is why scholars have to say, well, something happened. They believed something. Something changed. And in looking at that, the fact that the apostles were willing to suffer and die for their testimony, well, it definitely is at least an evidence of their sincerity in their belief. Now, I want to be careful here. Sincerity of belief doesn't make a belief true, but it does show that they weren't deliberately lying. So, for example, if you look at the Watergate scandal, and Chuck Colson, who was a part of that scandal, later became a Christian, had noted this, that there was a cover-up, the idea that the men under the president, when he was running for re-election, snuck into the opponent's headquarters and tried to steal campaign strategies and things like that. Within 2 weeks of it being uncovered, this event being uncovered, all of the cover stories kind of blew up. Somebody leaked the data. Somebody didn't want to be put in jail. And people were all trying to scurry to save their own skins. This is part of human nature. This is what happens. But not one of the apostles renounced their belief. Not one of those followers of Jesus said that they were making it up. So they sincerely believed it. It was a sincerity of belief that means that there was some kind of real experience. But like I said, it doesn't mean that the belief is true. It just shows that they weren't deliberately lying. There wasn't a created myth. And you can believe something sincerely because you were taught it by someone else. But to believe that I myself have seen the risen Jesus, well, you either have to have seen him or not. So the belief is held by the original disciples of Jesus. And we know that legend and lies can't account for those resurrection appearances. They simply just don't have the time to develop from legends. And we know that lies don't make sense. Somebody would have cracked. Now, other contemporaries of the disciples also talk about the disciples of beliefs. In fact, Clement of Rome reports on the sufferings of Peter and Paul, and he talks about how they remained steadfast to their belief in Christ. Ignatius reports on the apostles, and he said they were so changed, they were unafraid of martyrdom, and they didn't mind it. They knew that there was something bigger than that. Not that they didn't mind it, but it wasn't something that they shirked from. Again, vast difference than what we see prior to that. Polycarp, Dionysius, Tertullian, Origen, all of these guys show that the apostles actually held to the risen Christ. So the question becomes, what explains these things? How do we explain it? If it wasn't the risen Christ, what was it? Hallucination? Well, how do you get 500 people hallucinating the same way at the same time? That doesn't make any sense. You never have the same. It's like saying everybody dreamed the same dream, right? It's unconvincing. And then you have the other problems. You still have the empty tomb problem. A hallucination doesn't produce an empty tomb, right? There are all these issues. A hallucination wouldn't tell you that the women saw it first. It makes no sense. So we know that the disciples had this experience. And the most important experience, though, I think, and the one that's the most convincing in my mind, is the experience that Paul has and the experience also that James has. Because here are two individuals who weren't part of Jesus' crowd during Jesus' earthly ministry. In fact, these were skeptics. And this is my last point, my fifth point, the conversion of skeptics. The conversion of the skeptic James. Now, James was Jesus' brother. We recognize that. And prior to Jesus' resurrection, Jesus' brothers did not hold him in high regard concerning his teachings anyway. We know that they were unbelievers prior to his resurrection. We can look at passages such as Mark chapter 3, specifically verses 21 and 31, where they're thinking, what are you doing teaching these kinds of things? In fact, in Mark chapter 6, they come to take Jesus away because they think he's talking crazy talk. They're going to lock him up. And in John chapter 7, verse 5 as well, Mary and Jesus' brothers show up, and they just don't understand why he would even make such audacious claims. But 1 Corinthians reports the appearance to James. So in 1 Corinthians 15, we see that Jesus appeared to James. In Matthew 28, in fact, when Jesus appears to Mary, he says, "Go tell my brothers that you have seen me." And not only go tell my disciples, but he says, go tell my brothers. So Jesus appears to James. And James turns from being someone who says, I don't know what my brother's thinking, to the head of the church in Jerusalem. He becomes the leader of the Christian movement in Jerusalem. That's an amazing aspect. Paul, in Galatians and Acts, reports that James was the leader of the early church, and Eusebius says that the charge of the church passed to James, the brother of the Lord, together with the apostles. Now, he's called James the Just by all men from the Lord's time to ours, since many are called James, but he was holy from his mother's womb. This was the James that we're referring to, James, the brother of Jesus. And Josephus tells us that James was martyred. He suffered. Annas became the new high priest and, quote, summoned to the court of the Sanhedrin, brought before it the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, James was his name, and certain others, and after accusing them of transgressing the law, delivered them up to be stoned. So James was martyred again very, very early. And again, held to the belief that Jesus was raised from the dead. But the biggest conversion, the biggest point, was the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. Here we have a persecutor of the church, someone with enough religious zeal to go after the Christians and try and stop them. What changed him into the greatest evangelist the church has ever seen? Now, Paul gives us his biography in Galatians and others. He writes that he was a Jewish Pharisee. He tells us he was trained under Gamaliel, one of the top rabbinic scholars of that day. It would be the Harvard of the Jewish day, so to speak. You know, Gamaliel was considered top flight. And because of this, because he was a Pharisee and such a strict stickler of the law, trained that way, Christianity represented to him the most repugnant ideas he could think of. It was akin to taking God's name and dragging it through the mud. How can you say this is the Son of God, right? It's ugly to Paul, Saul of Tarsus at that time. It's so ugly that he goes and asks, right? He sits there when Stephen is being stoned in front of the Jewish leadership. He holds the guy's coats. He was obviously a student at this point in his life. He was very, very young, so he wasn't the one doing the direct accusing. But as you know, young men, 17, 18, they got a lot of fire in their belly. They tend to believe their cause is just regardless of anything else, and they will run with the most zeal in order to defend it at all costs. And so this is what we see. And that's what Paul did. He sought to defend what he believed was true Judaism against this terrible, terrible scourge of new Christianity. Yet, something changed. Even though he petitioned the high court to go and capture Christians, and he started doing so very, very effectively, he was on his way to Damascus when something turned him around. And in fact, he was transformed very early in this process to believe that Jesus is risen. So we know from 1 Corinthians 15, 9 and 10, as well as Galatians 1, 13 through 23, that it was just a couple of years after Jesus rose again that Paul was in this mission to squelch Christianity wherever it reared its head, but he was changed. How do we explain that? If Paul didn't see the risen Jesus, how can we explain what happened to him? What would change? He wouldn't want to fantasize and hallucinate a risen Jesus. That doesn't make sense. So, what can we know? What's the historical bedrock? We know that Jesus lived. And how do we explain Paul or the Gospels if Jesus didn't live? In fact, Thomas Cooper, in his book, The Bridge of History Over the Gulf of Time, I think he puts the problem on the doubters, and I think he explains it well. He writes, quote, "Who can ponder on Paul's history without feeling that it must be regarded as part of the evidence for the truth of Christianity? Paul's existence, and of course life, and the writings of his letters to the Christian churches are held to be facts by all the German and French schools of skepticism. And that Reverend Robert Taylor that I mentioned to you, who some 50 years ago was a favorite of the London Freethinkers, he was a skeptic back then. He writes, he holds these same facts. But what a puzzling contradiction it seems for men to acknowledge the reality in life of the recorded acts of Paul as facts, and yet to deny the truth of Christianity. What? Paul, a real man and Christ a myth? Paul, a real existence? Paul, who wrote so much about Christ so soon after his death and resurrection. Paul, a real existing man and Christ's existence a fable? Paul, who held the clothes of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, while they stoned him to death? Well, then Stephen also was a real existing man who died praying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Paul, the glorious half missionary, half mechanic, who crossed the Mediterranean and the Adriatic and visited so many shores preaching Christ, and yet there was never any Christ to preach? Paul, a real living man who had seen and conversed with Peter and James and John? Well, then they were real and living men. How came they to say that what they did about Christ if he never existed? How came they to speak of his miracles to the people who must have seen Christ's wondrous acts if ever he performed them? Must they not have expected the people to say, you're imposters? No such miracles were ever performed. Yet no one said this. Even the worst of enemies of Christ did not deny his miracles, though they attributed them to satanic agency. And I think he makes a good point there. I think that's a clear aspect of what is at stake. If you deny the fact that Jesus was real, well, then you have to deny Paul. You have to deny all the apostles. You have to deny everything. And that's just simply far too much to give up because we have the writings of Paul. So what does that leave us? In fact, as I said, Bart Ehrman stated that the claim that Jesus was simply made up falters on every ground. The alleged parallels between Jesus and those pagan savior gods in most instances, they actually reside in a modern imagination, he writes. We do not have accounts of others who were born to virgin mothers and who died as an atonement for sin and then were raised from the dead, despite what the sensationalists claim ad nauseum in their propagandized versions. Now, Bart Ehrman goes on to say, one may well choose to resonate with the concerns of our modern and postmodern cultural despisers of established religion or not. But surely the best way to promote any such agenda is not to deny what virtually every sane historian on the planet, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, pagan, agnostic, atheist, what have you, has come to conclude based on a range of compelling historical evidence. Whether we like it or not, Jesus certainly existed. So I'm with Bart Ehrman on that. I think he's correct there. So what do we know? We know Jesus died by crucifixion. He's not a myth. We know that he existed. We know that he died by crucifixion. We know that the tomb of Jesus was empty. We know that Jesus' disciples sincerely believed he rose and appeared to them. And we know that the skeptics like James and the persecutor Paul were transformed from persecution to promoter of Christianity. Now, let me give you an analogy to show you just again how powerful this is using a modern day example. If you remember the movie Forrest Gump, Forrest Gump was a vastly popular film. It's another one of those films. It was meant for entertainment. It's not a documentary, but it does touch on many historical points of interest that were true. Those were fads, both pop culture things and the Vietnam War and things like that. They were absolutely real events that happened in history. And the movie makers kind of put Forrest Gump in the middle of these true historical events. Now, Forrest Gump was made in 1994, and it's about 25 years old. And it's about the same time span, and it declares things in the 60s and 70s. So it's 25 years prior to it, right? So if you think about 1 Corinthians, I'm talking about Paul writing 25 years after the events that he is describing. Forrest Gump comes out in theaters 25 years after the events that it portrays in the film. In Forrest Gump, the filmmaker tells the story of, again, modern American culture, putting Tom Hanks in these real world scenarios. He gets certain details right. The jogging trend, for example, the happy face, the way the president would greet college champions, things of that nature. All of those things actually happen. Now, imagine someone in the Middle East, a high-ranking militant of ISIS, or somebody who fought to establish the Taliban's rule. He's passionate about establishing Islamic Sharia law all the world over. I mean, he's sacrificed himself for the Mujahideen. He's convinced that every belief other than Islam is blasphemy. This Taliban member sees the movie Forrest Gump, sees that the Bubba Gump Shrimp Company restaurants, well, they exist, and he knows enough of the history of the U.S. to know that the film reflects the history in some way. Maybe he even believes that Forrest Gump did exist somewhere. Would any of that make him renounce his affinity to Islam? Would any of that make him leave the Taliban and become an active crusader for Forrest Gump and the American way? Do you think that he would change his name to Buzz Summers and join the Baptist Church? Does anyone really think that such a carefully crafted tale would reverse everything that this Taliban official holds to be true? Of course not. It's ridiculous. But that's what the skeptics want us to believe. No, the evidence is too clear. If the resurrection really happened, it's not just an interesting historical detail. It changes everything. But if it didn't, then we're left trying to explain a set of facts that refuse to go away. Either way, this isn't something you can just ignore. So the real question is this: what do you think the best explains the evidence? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. And if you find this video to be helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's been asking these same questions. Now, until next time, I hope you'll keep thinking and join me on the next Come Let Us Reason Together. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.